Sometimes you just see something wrong and realize, if you stay quiet, you're part of it. That night, I was walking with my kids after work when I saw a woman in a wheelchair stopped outside a restaurant. The hostess was smiling, but her words, they were shutting her out. My daughter tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Dad, that's not fair." And she was right. So I crossed the street. I didn't know it then, but that one step would change everything. The evening air carried a soft chill, the kind that hinted at the first touch of autumn. Mark adjusted the collar of his jacket as he walked down Main Street with his two kids, Emma and Ryan, one on each side. They'd just come from the park, their laughter still echoing faintly behind them, the streetlights flickering to life above. It was supposed to be an easy night. Grab a quick dinner, maybe share a milkshake, head home. But fate had other plans waiting at the corner cafe. As they approached, Mark noticed a woman near the entrance of a restaurant across the street. She sat in a wheelchair, her gloved hands resting quietly on the rims, her posture straight but tense. The hostess standing at the door wore a polite smile. Too polite, the kind that hides discomfort. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the hostess said, her voice light but final. "We don't have space for a chair that size inside. It's a narrow walkway, and we can't block the aisles. It's against policy." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "I could sit near the window," she offered softly. "I won't be in the way." "I'm afraid that won't work either," the hostess replied. She gave a quick glance toward the manager inside, who avoided eye contact. The door closed a little too quickly after she stepped back inside. Mark froze mid-step. His kids followed his gaze. Emma frowned first. "Dad, they didn't let her in?" He didn't answer right away. The woman sat there for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Not anger, not tears, just quiet humiliation. The kind of pain that comes from being reminded, yet again, that kindness isn't always a given. Ryan tugged on his sleeve. "That's not fair." Mark's chest tightened. It wasn't. But he knew the world often wasn't fair, and silence made it worse. He looked at his kids, then at the woman still parked by the closed door. He saw himself reflected in that small moment. The years of learning to keep his head down, to avoid scenes. But something about her stillness, the way she tried to hold her dignity together, broke that habit. Without overthinking, he stepped off the curb and crossed the street. "Stay close," he said over his shoulder. The woman looked up as he approached, surprised. "Hey," Mark said, voice calm but firm. "They really wouldn't let you in?" She gave a small laugh, the kind that hides hurt. "Apparently, accessibility isn't part of the menu." He smiled faintly at her dry humor. "Well, that's their loss. There's a diner just across the street that's got better food anyway, and bigger hearts." Her eyes searched his, wary but curious. "You don't even know me." "Doesn't matter," Mark said, motioning toward the diner. "Everyone deserves dinner." Emma piped up, voice bright and innocent. "You can eat with us. They have the best fries." For the first time that night, the woman's smile reached her eyes. "You sure you don't mind?" Mark shook his head. "Not one bit. Come on. I've got two hungry critics, and they'll talk about fries all night if we don't move." She chuckled softly and turned her chair. As they rolled toward the crosswalk together, the city's hum seemed to quiet around them. Mark didn't look back at the restaurant they'd left behind. He didn't need to. The decision was already made, a small act of defiance that would ripple far beyond that cold doorway. The crosswalk's signal blinked to a white figure, and wheels met pavement with a soft, purposeful whisper. Mark kept a steady pace at the woman's side, his kids a step behind, the four of them moving as if they'd always been meant to make this crossing together. The restaurant they'd left fell behind them like a door closing on a drafty room. Ahead, the little diner's windows threw warm light across the sidewalk, a glow that made the chrome trim shine and the chalkboard menu look like a promise. "Do they really have bigger hearts?" the woman asked, half teasing, half testing the words as if they might dissolve in the air. "They do," Mark said, "and open minds, which is a better policy than whatever we just saw." Emma skipped ahead and pressed the door plate, then darted back to hold the frame, a little overeager, a little proud of herself. Before she could say anything, the diner owner appeared, an older man with soft lines around his eyes, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has seen every kind of customer and still expects the best in them. He took in the scene in one glance, the chair, the kids, the careful quiet between strangers, and widened the doorway with a practiced sweep of his arm. "Come on in," he said. "You're just in time. I can make room by the front window." SD 12112. The words were simple, but their ease mattered. No hesitation, no explainers, no rules recited like a barrier. Just welcome. Inside, the diner carried the familiar perfume of butter and coffee, with a sizzle from the flat top and the clink of glassware stacking. The owner guided them to a table by the big window, then, with a quick, efficient grace, shifted a chair aside and nudged the table a few inches for better clearance. "How's that?" he asked, not as a favor granted, but as a standard of service. "It's perfect," the woman said, letting out a breath Mark suspected she'd been holding for blocks. Ryan slid into the booth first, pressing his palms to the cool laminate like he could feel the warmth in it. Emma scooted in beside him. Mark waited, letting the woman turn and settle at the table's edge, giving her the time to move at her pace rather than theirs. She gave him a small nod, not gratitude exactly, something quieter and braver, and he took his seat across from the kids. A server appeared with 4 waters and a smile that reached her voice. "You folks want menus, or do you already know what you need?" "Fries," Emma said, without looking at the menu. "We're on a mission." "That we are," Mark said, fighting a grin. To the woman, they're strict critics. If the fries pass, everything else is forgiven. "I'll put in the order," the server said, amused. "Fries first." It's the law. The first minutes felt like a stuttered film. Small talk, the courteous shuffle toward comfort. Mark asked if the window seat was too bright, if the fan above was too drafty, if she wanted to adjust the table more. She waved off each concern gently, as if she was careful not to take up space even after being invited to. It struck him, not for the first time, how the world can train a person to apologize for existing. He wasn't going to let that happen at this table. The server returned with a basket big enough to be a dare. Golden fries steaming in a paper cradle, 2 tiny steel cups of ketchup, 1 of mustard, and a small ramekin of something house-made that caught the light like honey. Emma's gasp was theatrical. Ryan's was reverent. "This is research," he informed the table. "Serious business," Mark agreed. "Try the sauce before you write your report." As the kids debated crispness and dip ratios, the woman's posture eased by inches. The noise of the diner, the low rumble of conversation, the gentle clatter of plates, seemed to lift her shoulders instead of weighing them down. The server reappeared with menus, and the owner checked in from the counter with a lifted chin. "The Universal Restaurant sign for everything good?" It was more than good. "Burgers are kind of the star here," Mark offered. "But the Turkey Club is dangerously persuasive." He caught himself and added, "Only if you're hungry for it. No pressure." "I could eat," she said, smiling for real this time. "It's been a long day." "Then we should fix that." The ease in his voice surprised him. This was not how he'd planned their night, not how he planned anything. But sometimes the right choice felt less like a decision and more like stepping into a space that was already waiting for you. When the server came back to take orders, the kids performed their now-honed fry analysis, delivering a unanimous verdict. Exceptional. The server placed a hand over her heart. That means the kitchen can breathe again. The moment drew a quiet laugh from the woman, and Mark watched something unspool in her expression, a thread of tension loosening, dignity returning in steady measures. He didn't press for details about what had happened across the street. The facts were plain enough. He wouldn't make her carry them any further tonight. As their meals went in and conversation began to find a rhythm, the woman glanced at Emma and Ryan and then at Mark, as if checking whether the ground beneath them would hold. "I'm glad you crossed over," she said softly. "Me too," Mark replied. He meant the street, yes, but also the small but real distance between being a witness and being a participant in someone else's moment. Through the window, the streetlights pooled on the pavement like calm water. Inside, the diner's warmth gathered them in. Plates would arrive soon, burgers and fries, if tradition had anything to say about it. And with them, the comfortable disorder of a shared table, passing napkins, negotiating halves, reaching for a story to trade for a bite. For now, it was enough that they were here, that the door had opened easily, that the space had rearranged itself without ceremony so they could belong. Within minutes, they would be laughing over food they hadn't expected to share together. The kind of ordinary joy that feels rare enough to memorize. "Welcome," the owner called from the counter, as if he'd read the scene the way a good host reads a room. You picked the best seat in the house. Maybe they had. Maybe the best seat is any place where people decide, quietly and together, to make room. The sound of sizzling on the grill filled the diner, blending with the soft hum of old jazz playing from a speaker above the counter. Mark leaned back slightly, letting his shoulders relax for the first time that evening. The warmth in the air seemed to melt away the tension that had hung over them on the sidewalk. Across from him, the woman finally smiled. A real, unguarded smile that softened her sharp cheekbones and lit her dark eyes. "I'm Sarah," she said, breaking the brief silence. "I realized I never introduced myself." "Mark," he replied. "And these are my food critics, Emma and Ryan." Emma gave a dramatic wave with a fry in hand, and Ryan grinned, ketchup on his chin. "Dad says we take our job very seriously," he added. Sarah laughed, a clear, melodic sound that drew glances from nearby tables. "It looks like you do." Mark found himself laughing too, not out of politeness, but from something lighter, something close to relief. For once, it wasn't a night of small talk or tired routines. There was something alive about this simple moment. Strangers sharing warmth in a booth by the window, the world outside a muted blur. "So," he said, "was tonight your plan all along? To test which restaurants actually mean it when they say all customers welcome?" Sarah smiled, but her eyes dimmed slightly. "I just wanted a normal evening. Someplace to eat without planning 10 steps ahead. You'd be surprised how often I get turned away. They say it's because of space, insurance, safety, you name it. But really, it's just discomfort. People don't know what to do when someone doesn't fit their picture of normal." Emma's small hand reached across the table, resting near Sarah's. "You can eat with us anytime," she said softly. Sarah's voice caught, but she smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart. You have a kind heart." Mark swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if it was pride or the sudden reminder of how easily children understand what adults complicate. He cleared his throat and said gently, "You shouldn't have to explain yourself to anyone. People should just do better." She nodded. "You'd think so. But kindness, it's not as common as it should be." Their meals arrived, burgers stacked high, fries refilled, and milkshakes crowned with whipped cream. The kids immediately dove in, Emma humming in satisfaction. Mark caught Sarah watching them with something wistful in her expression. "Do you have kids?" he asked, then immediately regretted the assumption. "No," she said softly. "I always thought I would. But the accident changed things." She paused, meeting his gaze. 5 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light. I woke up in the hospital 2 weeks later. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. Some days, it doesn't feel that way." Mark didn't look away. "That's a heavy thing to carry." Sarah shrugged lightly. "I don't carry it anymore. I just roll with it." Her small smile didn't erase the truth in her tone. "I learned to build a new life. I work, I travel, I get mad at bad TV. I just wanted tonight to be ordinary, to feel like everyone else for an hour." Ryan's voice broke the quiet. "You are like everyone else. You're funny. And you eat fries faster than Dad." Sarah laughed again, this time fuller, freer. "I'll take that as a compliment." Mark smiled, feeling a faint tug in his chest. For months, maybe years, he had gone through evenings in silence. Polite dinners, bedtime routines, empty spaces left behind by someone who used to fill them. But tonight felt human again. He glanced toward the window. Outside, the restaurant across the street still gleamed, its tables half empty, its door closed. He thought of how small choices, a word, a smile, a seat offered, could turn loneliness into belonging. When Sarah spoke again, her tone was lighter. "You really think this diner's better than that one?" "I know it is," Mark said. "And not just because of the food." Their eyes met. Just a brief moment. Simple and unspoken, but it carried more honesty than most conversations he'd had in years. Around them, the diner carried on. The clink of cups, the hum of life, the sound of laughter that had found its way back into the night. By the time the plates were empty and the milkshakes reduced to streaks of chocolate and melting ice cream, the diner had thinned out. The neon lights outside painted soft streaks of pink and blue across the window, and the hum of conversation had faded to a quiet background rhythm. For a few long minutes, no one seemed in a hurry to move. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her wheelchair. "That might have been the best burger I've had in a long time," she said, her tone playfully serious. Emma grinned. Told you they were the best. They might be right, Mark said, pretending to inspect his empty plate. You may have just discovered the greatest fries in Colorado. Ryan stretched in his seat, yawning. We should make this our regular spot, Dad. Mark smiled faintly, watching the easy comfort between them all. I think that's a pretty good idea. Then Sarah reached into her small crossbody bag and began to pull out her wallet. Please, she said, her tone firm but kind. Let me cover dinner. It's the least I can do. Mark shook his head immediately. No way. You're our guest tonight. But you didn't have to invite me, she insisted, her eyes steady. You don't even know me. Doesn't matter, he replied gently. You were treated unfairly, and my kids were hungry. That sounds like destiny to me. She laughed, a soft, grateful sound that seemed to fill the space between them. You're stubborn, you know that? I've been told, Mark said, smiling. The server returned with the check, but before Sarah could reach for it, Mark slid his card across the table. Already taken care of, he said, his voice carrying that mix of humor and quiet finality that left no room for debate. Sarah sighed, but her eyes softened. All right then, but next time, dinner's on me. Deal, he said, though he doubted there would be a next time. People pass through each other's lives like brief intersections, bright flashes, then gone. Still, he hoped she meant it. Emma leaned forward. Can we see you again? Sarah hesitated for a second, then smiled at the little girl's hopeful expression. Maybe, she said. The world's smaller than it looks. They stood to leave. The diner owner waved from behind the counter, calling out, Take care now. Sarah thanked him warmly as Mark held the door open for her, letting the cool night air rush in. Outside, the city was quieter now, the street lamps humming, the asphalt slick from a light drizzle. At the curb, Sarah paused and turned to Mark. You know, she said, I was about 2 minutes away from giving up tonight. I don't usually let things like that restaurant get to me, but, she looked down, her voice dropping. It's exhausting, always having to prove you belong somewhere. Mark nodded slowly. I get that. I've had my share of doors closed too. Different kind. Maybe, but the feeling's the same. She met his gaze. Then maybe that's why you noticed. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, almost peaceful, the kind that comes when two people understand something without needing to say it. Thank you, she said quietly, for seeing me. He smiled. Anytime. Sarah adjusted her gloves, turned the small joystick on her chair, and began to roll away. Mark watched until she reached the corner, her silhouette framed by the glow of the streetlight. She stopped, looked back, and gave a small wave. Emma waved furiously. Bye, Sarah. Ryan added. Don't forget, next time's on you. Sarah's laugh carried faintly through the cool air. I won't, she called back before turning down the next street. As they walked to their car, Mark felt a strange mix of calm and wonder. The night had started as an ordinary errand, a quick dinner, a quiet walk home, but it had become something different, something lasting. When Emma slipped her hand into his, she asked softly, Dad, why didn't they let her eat there? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, because sometimes people forget what fairness looks like. Emma thought for a moment. Then I'm glad we remembered. Mark squeezed her hand gently. Me too, kiddo. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the diner's neon glow shrinking behind them. A small pocket of light in a world that often forgot how simple kindness could be. 2 quiet weeks passed before that night returned to Mark's thoughts. Life had fallen back into its usual rhythm. Morning alarms, rushed breakfasts, the sound of his kids arguing over who got the last waffle. Work at the auto shop kept him busy, his hands always smelling faintly of oil and metal, his back aching by noon. Life wasn't easy, but it was steady, predictable, even. Then one Tuesday evening, he came home to find a thick envelope sitting on the small table by the door. No return address, just his name, written in graceful, deliberate handwriting that looked familiar somehow. He turned it over in his hands, frowning. Bills didn't come in envelopes like this. He slid it open carefully, and a folded letter slipped out, along with a check. For a moment, he just stared. The check was large, shockingly large. Then his eyes caught the name printed at the top, Sarah Donovan. He sank into the nearest chair, heart thudding, and began to read. Dear Mark, that night you reminded me that kindness still exists. You didn't know this, but I own a chain of restaurants across Colorado, the kind of places where people go to feel welcome. Or at least, that's what I thought they were. The restaurant that turned me away that evening used to be one of mine. It's not anymore. I've decided to sell it and use the profits to help make restaurants across the state more accessible. Ramps, wider doors, better training for staff. No one should ever be told there's no room for them. But there's something else. I'd like to offer you a job managing one of my new locations. It's flexible, family-friendly, and comes with full benefits. Consider it a thank you for standing up for what's right. With gratitude, Sarah. Mark read the letter twice, then a third time. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the words sank in. A chain of restaurants. Selling one to build better spaces. Offering him a job. It felt impossible. Too big, too good. He looked again at the check resting on the table, his name written neatly across the bottom corner. It wasn't just a token of thanks. It was an act of faith, one that believed in the kind of man he'd tried to be that night. Dad. Emma's voice broke the silence as she and Ryan came running in. What's wrong? You look funny. Mark laughed, still half-dazed. Nothing's wrong, he said, wiping a hand over his face. Something wonderful just happened. He handed the letter to Emma, who read it out loud in careful bursts, her brow furrowing with each line. Ryan peered over her shoulder, wide-eyed. She's giving you a job? He asked in disbelief. Like a real one? Mark nodded slowly. Looks that way. And money, Emma whispered, glancing at the check like it might disappear. Yeah, he said quietly. But that's not the part that matters most. He looked at his children, their faces glowing with excitement, confusion, awe, and felt something stirred deep in his chest. He'd spent years trying to hold things together, to make up for what life had taken from them. All he'd wanted that night was to show them that decency mattered, that even when no one was watching, you stood up for people. He never imagined the lesson would echo back this way. Ryan grinned. So, when do you start? Mark chuckled, shaking his head. I don't even know yet. But I guess soon. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope, as if afraid to crease something sacred. Outside the window, dusk painted the world in soft shades of gold and blue. For the first time in a long while, Mark didn't feel tired, not of the world, not of trying. Sometimes, he realized, life doesn't reward you with applause or recognition. Sometimes it just circles back, quietly, and reminds you that the good you put out doesn't vanish. It waits, somewhere, for the right moment to return. That night, after the kids went to bed, Mark stood by the kitchen counter, letter in hand, reading the final lines again. He smiled, a quiet, grateful smile that no one saw, and whispered to himself, guess kindness really does come full circle. A month later, Mark stood outside the entrance of a brand new restaurant. The early morning sunlight bounced off the freshly cleaned windows, where a bright sign read, Harvest Table, everyone welcome. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the collar of his new uniform, light gray, simple, embroidered with his name. His reflection in the glass looked almost unfamiliar. The same tired eyes, yes, but steadier, lighter somehow. Inside, the air carried the crisp scent of fresh paint and roasted coffee. Tables gleamed beneath soft pendant lights, and the floor layout was wide and open, every aisle generous enough for wheelchairs, strollers, and walkers alike. A ramp curved gracefully toward the patio doors. The sound of distant traffic faded as the space filled instead with the quiet rhythm of a new beginning. Dad, Emma's voice echoed through the hallway. She ran toward him, her hair bouncing, holding Ryan's hand. It's so big. Can we sit anywhere? He smiled. Almost anywhere. But maybe not on the counter this time. Ryan looked around, his eyes wide. This place looks like one of those fancy restaurants on TV. Mark crouched beside them, lowering his voice to something warm and serious. This isn't just a restaurant, guys. It's a place where everyone gets to belong. That's our rule number one. Emma nodded solemnly, as if being entrusted with a sacred mission. Even people in wheelchairs? Especially them, he said softly. Behind them, a familiar voice called. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Mark turned. Sarah was rolling in from the entrance, wearing a light blazer over a soft blue blouse, her hair tied back neatly. She looked rested, content, a woman who had found her purpose and decided to share it. Sarah, Mark said with a grin. You made it. Of course, she replied. I wouldn't miss opening day. Besides, she added with a teasing smile, someone has to make sure my new manager doesn't burn the place down. He chuckled. No promises. Sarah's gaze swept over the restaurant. The wide aisles, the tables arranged in easy harmony. You did a beautiful job, Mark. This is exactly what I pictured. He rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. I just followed your blueprint. You did more than that, she said. You gave it heart. The first customers began trickling in, an older couple holding hands, a mother with a baby stroller, two young men guiding their grandfather carefully toward a window seat. The place filled with movement and quiet chatter. Mark greeted them all personally, showing them to their tables, making sure everyone felt seen. When he returned to the counter, Sarah was watching him with that small, knowing smile. You were meant for this, she said. He laughed softly. I never thought I'd be managing a restaurant. A month ago, I was still fixing carburetors. Funny how life reroutes you when you least expect it, she said. A few hours later, after the rush settled, Sarah called him over to the front wall. A single framed photo hung there, the picture from that night at the diner. Sarah, Mark, and the kids smiling around a cluttered table of fries and milkshakes. Beneath it, a simple brass plaque gleamed. Kindness is the true recipe for success. For a moment, Mark couldn't speak. The photo brought back every detail. The laughter, the warmth, the choice he hadn't thought twice about. It felt like standing in the echo of a miracle that had started with something as simple as doing the right thing. Sarah looked at him and said quietly, I wanted this up front. A reminder of how one small act can ripple outward. Mark swallowed hard. Thank you, he said. Not for the job, for believing that night mattered. It did, she said. It always will. They stood there together for a moment, the photo glinting softly in the afternoon light. Behind them, the low hum of conversation and clinking plates sounded like life in motion, a melody of inclusion, warmth, and ordinary goodness. Mark exhaled and smiled. All right, he said, clapping his hands. Back to work. Let's make sure every person who walks in feels welcome. Sarah nodded. That's the spirit. As she rolled toward the patio to greet new guests, Mark watched her for a moment before returning to the counter. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open, wide and generous, just like the doors of the restaurant he now called home. The months that followed blurred into a steady rhythm of laughter, movement, and purpose. Every morning, Mark arrived early to unlock the doors of Harvest Table, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee greeting him like an old friend. By noon, the restaurant buzzed with energy, families, retirees, teenagers after school, even a few regulars who used wheelchairs and said, half-jokingly, that they came for the freedom of space as much as for the food. Mark greeted each one by name. He'd learned their favorite orders, their stories, their quirks. To him, this wasn't management, it was connection. The team had taken his quiet example to heart. They treated every guest as if they mattered, because they did. It wasn't about customer service. It was about dignity. Sometimes, customers would pause near the framed photo on the wall. That image of Mark, Sarah, and the kids from the diner, laughter caught mid-moment. Beneath it, the plaque gleamed softly under the lights. Kindness is the true recipe for success. People asked about it almost every day. Who are they? Someone would say, pointing to the photo. Mark never hurried his answer. He'd wipe his hands on a towel, lean against the counter, and tell the story, not for attention, not to make himself the hero, but to remind anyone listening what one simple act of decency could do. He'd tell them how, on an ordinary night, he saw a woman turned away for being different. How his children watched it happen. How they chose to cross the street instead of walking past. And how that choice had changed their lives forever. Emma, who sometimes helped after school, loved to jump in. Dad always says kindness is like a seed, she'd explain proudly. It doesn't grow where it's shouted. It grows where it's shown. Ryan would add with a grin. And fries help, too. Customers laughed, but their eyes softened, the kind of softness that comes from recognition. Because everyone, in some way, had known rejection. Everyone had needed someone to stand up once on their behalf. On quieter nights, after closing, Mark would wipe the counters while the lights dimmed to a soft amber. He'd glance at the photo by the door, the reflection of the words beneath it rippling faintly on the glass. Kindness is the true recipe for success. He never got tired of reading it. Sarah still visited often. She and Mark had become partners in more ways than title. She handled the broader vision, while he kept the soul of the place intact. Together, they trained new managers for future branches, teaching not just efficiency, but empathy. She always said, good food fills people for a day. Good service fills them for a moment. But kindness, that feeds something deeper. One evening, as the last table cleared and Sarah prepared to leave, she paused beside the photo and looked at him. Do you ever think about how small it started? She asked quietly. Every day, Mark replied. She smiled. That's why it worked. After she left, Mark stood by the window, watching the street lamps flicker to life. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, settling gently over the sidewalk. He thought about that first night again, about crossing the street without a plan, just an instinct to do the right thing. It had felt so simple at the time. But maybe that was the truth about decency. It didn't need an audience. It only needed a moment. He turned off the lights, leaving one lamp glowing near the photo, a small pool of warmth in the darkened room. Then he whispered, almost to himself, you never know whose life you might touch. When he stepped outside, the snow crunched softly under his boots. Behind him, through the glass, the framed photo gleamed faintly under the single light, like a quiet reminder to anyone passing by. Kindness doesn't fade. It travels, from one act to the next, from one stranger to another, multiplying every time someone chooses to care. And on nights like this, Mark believed more than ever that goodness, once shared, always finds its way home.